Gunshots shattered the quiet night. Flames erupted from three corners of the barn, swallowing the darkness and the terrified screams of the horses trapped inside. A towering figure stepped into the yard. Well over 6.5 feet tall, broad-shouldered, golden hair braided tight. She carried no weapon. She did not run. When the mounted gunman charged, her hand shot out and seized the bridle. The horse reared and thrashed, but her grip held like iron. It could not break free. Another shot cracked through the air. The bullet tore into the shoulder of the man on the ground. Blood spread fast across the dirt. She did not look back. She walked forward, each heavy step shaking the dry earth. The remaining riders tightened their grips on their rifles, but their hands trembled. For the first time, they understood. What they had come to burn tonight was no ordinary ranch. Something stronger had awakened here, and it was not letting go. The wind came down off the Bitterroot Range that morning, like it had somewhere else to be. Colton Hollis stood on the porch and watched it move through the wheat that wasn't wheat anymore, just stubble, just brown stalks bent low, broken, picked clean by a summer that hadn't given them a single decent rain. He had his hat in his hand instead of on his head. Habit. His father used to do that when he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to think about. 3 years since the old man died. 3 years since this ranch became Colton's problem instead of his inheritance. Behind him, the house creaked. Old wood settling into an old foundation. Everything on the Hollis place was old now. Old and tired and hanging on by nothing but stubbornness, which was the one crop that never failed them. He thought about the day his father had handed him the deed, folded into quarters, the paper soft with age. Not much of a ceremony to it. Just a tired old man sitting at the kitchen table, coughing into his sleeve, saying, "It's yours now, Colt. Try not to let it beat you." 3 months later he was gone, and the wheat had started dying the following spring. Like the land itself had decided to grieve along with the family. He heard Reeve's boots on the stairs before he saw him. Fast, too fast. Reeve never walked into a room. He arrived in it. "You're still standing out here." Reeve leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. That grin already halfway up his face like it lived there. "Bank don't care how long you stare at the horizon, Colt. Numbers don't change just 'cause you're squinting at 'em hard enough. I know what the numbers are. Do you, though? Because last I heard we owe Merchants Trust $400 and some change we don't have, and the note comes due in 11 weeks, and we got exactly 2 ranch hands left who haven't quit on us for better pay somewhere. That isn't cursed. We're not cursed. Tell that to the wheat." Colton didn't answer that one. Couldn't, because the wheat was right there, dead and brown, and mocking him. And there wasn't a clever thing to say about a field that had given up. Inside, he could hear Abel's voice. Low, steady, reading something out loud to nobody, the way he did when he was working through a thought that hadn't finished forming yet. Abel always needed to hear his own reasoning to trust it. Third brother. Middle in age, middle in temperament. The one who kept the ledgers because he was the only one who didn't flinch from bad math. And somewhere out past the barn, a whoop went up. High and bright and entirely too cheerful for a ranch this close to ruin. "That'll be Tate." Reeve didn't even turn to look. Boy's 20 years old and he still thinks breaking a horse is the same thing as having fun. It is fun. It's fun until it ain't. There was a sound of hooves circling, a shout, laughter that wasn't quite triumphant, and then the dull thud of a body hitting dirt. Reeve winced. That's the 4th time this week. He'll walk it off. He always does. Boy's got more hope than sense. Gets that from you, probably. Or from Ma. Never could figure which. Colton finally put his hat on. Because the sun was climbing and there was work, whether or not the work meant anything anymore. And because standing on a porch feeling sorry for himself wasn't a thing his father had ever taught him how to do. "Get Abel," he said. "And get Tate off that horse. We need to talk." Reeve didn't move right away. Studied his older brother for a moment, something unusually serious passing behind his eyes. "This about the bank. This is about the bank." Figured. Reeve pushed off the doorframe. "Give me 5 minutes." It took him closer to 15, mostly because Tate refused to come inside, until he'd made one more attempt at the horse. a broad-chested gray gelding that had thrown him 3 times already and seemed disinclined to change its position on the matter. He came in at last with dirt on his shirt and a grin that hadn't dimmed one bit, dragging a kitchen chair back with a scrape that made Abel wince at the noise it did to his concentration. They sat around the kitchen table like men waiting for a verdict, which, in a way, they were. Abel had the ledger open in front of him, numbers in neat columns. Numbers that didn't lie, didn't soften, didn't care that this family had buried a father and a mother on this land and had nowhere else in the world to call home. $412, Abel said. Due by the 15th of October. We have $61 in a strong box and a herd that's worth maybe half what it was 3 years ago, because half of it's sick and the other half's too thin to sell for meat. Tate leaned forward, elbows on the table, hat still on, because Tate never remembered to take his hat off indoors. So we're not finished. Colton's voice came out harder than he meant it to. We just need what, Colt? A miracle? Silence. The kind that sits heavy in a room. The kind that makes a clock somewhere in the house sound louder than it has any right to be. And then Reeve, who had been unusually quiet for almost a full minute, which, for Reeve, was practically a religious experience, cleared his throat. I got an idea. Your ideas, Abel said, not looking up from the ledger, have gotten us a busted corral fence, a mule that hates all of us personally, and a black eye that took 2 weeks to heal. This one's different. They're always different. Hear me out. Reeve stood up, paced, which was also unlike him because Reeve didn't pace. Reeve sauntered. Reeve moved through the world like he already knew how it was going to treat him. But not now. He moved sense circling something he wasn't sure he believed himself. You all remember Cassidy Marsh. Runs the Mercantile. What about him? He gets papers shipped in from back east. Matrimonial papers. You know the kind. Fellas out here, they're lonesome. Ranch needs a woman's hand in it, so they write off for a bride. Sight unseen. She comes out on the stage, and if it takes, it takes. Silence again, but different this time. Thinking silence. You want us to buy wives, Tate said slowly. Like he was trying the words out to see if they made any more sense out loud. I want us to survive winter. Reeve stopped pacing. Looked at his brothers, one at a time, and for once there wasn't a joke behind his eyes. A ranch runs better with women in the house, Colt. You know that. Ma ran this place better than Pa did. And Pa would have been the first to say it. We need hands. We need somebody who can keep a garden, keep a kitchen, keep the books straight when Abel's off sulking over the herd count. And if we're being honest, 4 of us out here alone, we're going to go feral by Christmas. That's not a reason to marry a stranger. It's a reason to try. Reeve's voice softened, just barely. Just enough that Colton heard something underneath the joke. Something that sounded almost like fear. We're going to lose this place, Colt. And I know you'd rather die than say that out loud. So I'll say it for you. We are going to lose it, unless we do something. Anything. Colton looked around the table, at Abel, who had gone quiet, pen still in his hand, not writing. At Tate, who for once wasn't grinning, who was looking down at his own rough hands, like he was seeing them for the first time. At Reeve. Standing there, with his heart on his sleeve in a way he almost never allowed. You've all thought about this already, Colton said, haven't you? Before you brought it to me, talked about it some, Abel admitted. Reeve mostly. Tate's been for it since the word left Reeve's mouth. And you, Abel, closed the ledger, slow and deliberate. I've done the arithmetic 6 different ways, Colt. There's no version where we keep this ranch working the way we're working it now. We need more hands than we've got money to hire. Wives who'll work the land, who'll want to see it succeed same as us. That's the only math that closes the gap I can find. Colton thought about his father. About the way the old man used to say that a Hollis never let pride bury the family. Pride was for men who could afford it. Fine, Colton said, just that. One word. But it cracked something open in the room, some tension that had been building since the wheat died, and Tate let out a breath like he'd been holding it for 3 years. Fine, Colton said again, quieter, write the letters. They wrote the letters that night by lamplight, and it was, Colton would think later, one of the strangest evenings of his life. 4 grown men hunched over paper like schoolboys, trying to describe themselves to strangers, in a way that didn't sound desperate even though every last one of them was. Tate wrote 3 drafts and burned 2 of them in the stove. The first one, he later admitted, had described himself as the handsomest of my brothers, though they'll dispute it, and Reeve had read it over his shoulder and laughed so hard he'd had to sit down. The second draft was worse, all breathless enthusiasm, about horses and sunsets and the size of the sky out here, until it read less like a proposal and more like a boy trying to sell a stranger on a camping trip. The third one he kept close to his chest and wouldn't let anyone read, which everybody agreed was probably for the best. Abel wrote 1 draft, precise and careful, and then read it out loud to make sure the grammar held up under scrutiny it would never actually receive. He described the ranch honestly, described himself honestly too, which Reeve told him was probably a mistake. You wrote that you're of a bookish and retiring disposition, Reeve said, reading over his shoulder. Nobody's writing back to that. Somebody honest might. Somebody honest and desperate, maybe. Aren't we all? Abel said, and sealed the envelope. Before Reeve could argue further, Reeve wrote his in about 4 minutes flat, and didn't reread it once. Said overthinking a thing like this was how you talked yourself out of a good gamble. His letter was short, funny, a little too confident, exactly the kind of thing that would either charm a woman completely or annoy her past forgiveness, with no middle ground in between. He seemed entirely at peace with those odds. Colton stared at his blank page for the better part of an hour. What did you say? What did you put down on paper that would make some woman 1,000 miles away decide to hand her whole life over to a stranger on a dying ranch in a territory that ate people alive some winters? He thought about writing something grand, something that sounded like the kind of man worth crossing a continent for. He got 3 sentences into a draft like that before he crossed it all out, disgusted with himself because it wasn't true and he didn't want to start a marriage, even one this strange, on a lie he'd have to keep telling for the rest of his life. In the end, he wrote something short, plain. He didn't dress it up because he didn't know how, and because dressing it up felt like a lie he wasn't willing to tell before he'd even met her. He wrote that the ranch was struggling, that he was the eldest of 4 brothers and carried the weight of that he could offer hard work and honesty and not much else, not yet, though he intended to try for more. He sealed the envelope and didn't let himself read it again. 6 weeks. That's how long the waiting took. 6 weeks of watching the road. 6 weeks of pretending not to watch the road, which fooled exactly no one, because all 4 of them found excuses to be near the front gate whenever a rider passed through on the way to town. Tate volunteered for every trip into Promise Ridge that could conceivably require a second set of hands. Reeve started finding reasons to visit the mercantile that had nothing to do with actual mercantile business. Even Abel, who prided himself on not being a man ruled by nerves, took to reading his book on the porch step instead of by the fire, where he could watch the road without admitting that was what he was doing. 6 weeks of Tate asking, near daily, whether today might be the day. And then, on a Tuesday that started out looking like every other Tuesday, Cassidy Marsh rode out to the ranch himself, which he never did, which meant something. Got a telegram, he said, before he'd even climbed down off his horse. From the agency. Says your brides are coming in on the Thursday stage. 4 men went very still. All of them, Colton said. Same stage. That's what it says. Reeve let out a whoop that would have done Tit proud. Abel actually smiled, the rare kind, the kind that changed his whole face. And Tate looked like Christmas had come early and brought the whole world with it, spinning on his heel and nearly tripping over the porch, step in his hurry to tell the news to nobody in particular, since there was nobody else there to tell. Colton just nodded, said thank you, watched Cassidy ride off, and felt something in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile a word for what this was. More like the sound a rope makes right before it either holds or it doesn't. He spent that night lying awake, listening to his brothers' voices, carrying low and excited from down the hall, and wondered Not for the first time. What kind of woman answered a letter like the one he'd sent? What kind of desperation, or courage, or both, made a person climb onto a stage and ride 2 weeks west toward a man she'd never seen on the strength of a few honest sentences and nothing else? He didn't sleep much, didn't much mind that he didn't. Thursday came slow and then all at once. They stood on the platform outside the stage office. 4 brothers scrubbed clean and dressed in their one good set of clothes each, boots polished, hats brushed, looking like men trying very hard not to look like men who badly needed this to go well. Passus Ridge wasn't much of a town. One main street, a mercantile, a saloon, a church with a bell that only worked half the time, a bank that held the note on their entire future. But that morning it felt bigger than it ever had, because that morning the whole town seemed to know what was coming, and half of it had turned out to watch. "Remember the plan," Colton said low, most to Tate, who was practically vibrating where he stood. "We're gentlemen. We help with the trunks. We don't crowd them. Let them get their feet under them before we go asking anything of them." "I know how to treat a lady," Tate said. "You tripped over a hitching post last week because a girl smiled at you from the mercantile window. That was different, was it?" Reeve, standing beside them, with his hat tilted just so, muttered under his breath, "Lord, give me strength," which earned him an elbow from Abel that he pretended not to feel. The distant sound of hooves and wheels cut the argument short. Dust rose on the horizon, a plume of it catching gold in the morning light, and every head on that platform turned toward it at once. The stage came thundering in and skidded to a stop in front of the office, horses blowing hard, harness jingling. And the driver, a grizzled old man everyone called Pike, hollered down from his seat before he'd even set the brake. "Got your delivery, Hollis boys." And then he looked back over his shoulder toward the coach door, and something crossed his weathered face that none of the brothers had ever seen on him before. Something close to disbelief. "Better brace yourselves," Pike muttered. The door swung open. The first woman who stepped down from that stage had to duck and unfold herself, the way a person unfolds, from a space that was never built to hold them. And when she finally straightened up on the platform, the whole street went quiet, in a way Colton had never heard a street go quiet before. She was tall. Not tall like a tall woman is tall. Tall like she'd been carved from a different set of proportions altogether. Standing well over 6.5 feet, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of real strength and not just size, her hair a pale gold braided back from a face that was striking in its sharp, clean lines. She wore a traveling dress that had clearly been let out and lengthened. More than once. Seams straining at shoulders that no dressmaker in Boston had ever been asked to accommodate. She stood there on the platform in the sudden silence, chin lifted, eyes moving over the gathered crowd, with something that wasn't quite defiance and wasn't quite fear, something in between, something that had learned, the hard way, to expect the worst reaction and brace for it anyway. Somebody in the crowd gasped. A child's voice, high and clear, said, "Mama, look, she's a giant," and got hushed immediately. But not before the words hung there in the air for everyone to hear. Colton felt Tate go rigid beside him, felt Reeve's breath catch, and then the second woman stepped down, just as tall, dark hair instead of gold, and eyes that swept the crowd like she was already cataloging every threat in it, already deciding which of these staring townsfolk deserved a sharp word and which deserved worse. A third came after her, softer in her movements, somehow, despite standing every inch as tall as her sisters, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth, pressed carefully against her chest like it might break. And then a fourth. Younger, her eyes wide and searching the crowd with something that looked almost like hope, which on a fat size, in a town gone dead silent with shock, looked heartbreaking in a way Colton didn't have words for yet. 4 women, all of them enormous. All of them standing on that platform, in a town that had gone so quiet. You could hear the wind moving through the awnings. "Well, I'll be," Pike said from up on his seat. And nobody laughed, because nobody knew yet whether laughing was safe. Reeve found his voice first. "That's..." "I know," Colton said. "That's 4 of them. I know, Reeve." Tate hadn't said anything at all. He was just staring, mouth slightly open, at the youngest of the four women. And she was staring back at him with an expression that mirrored his own confusion, so exactly it might have been funny in a different town, on a different day. Abel stepped forward first, because somebody had to, and Colton's boots seemed rooted to the platform, and Reeve had apparently forgotten every clever thing he'd ever said in his entire life. "Ma'am," Abel said to the eldest. The golden-haired one who had stepped down first and now stood a little in front of the others, protective, the way you'd stand in front of something you needed to keep safe. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." "There's no mistake." Her voice, when it came, was low and even and carried further than it should have across that quiet street. "You rode to the agency. 4 brothers. 4 brides." Her jaw tightened just slightly, the only crack in an otherwise steady composure. "You are looking at all 4. Somewhere behind Colton, someone in the crowd whispered the word freak. Not loud. Not loud enough to be sure who'd said it, but loud enough that the eldest sister's eyes flicked toward the sound, and something in her face closed, just for a second, like a door shutting on a room nobody was allowed into. Colton felt something hot move through his chest. Anger, maybe. Or something closer to shame, though he couldn't yet say whose shame it was. He stepped forward. "I'm Colton Hollis." He took his hat off. Didn't know why exactly, except that it felt like the moment called for it. "These are my brothers. Reeve, Abel, Tate." Each name, a nod. "We weren't expecting," he stopped, started again. "We didn't know there'd be 4 of you. Would it have mattered?" "Not a question. A challenge, dressed up as one." "I don't know yet," Colton said honestly. "Ask me again in an hour." Something flickered across her face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Colton felt the tightness in his own chest ease by a fraction. "My name is Freya," she said. "Freya Nordahl. These are my sisters, Sigrid." A nod toward the dark-haired one with the sharp, assessing eyes. "Ingrid." The one with the bundle pressed to her chest, who offered a small, uncertain smile. And Liv, the youngest, still staring at Tate. Still being stared at right back. The crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, it had grown. More folks drifting out of the mercantile and the saloon to see what the commotion was. And the whispers were getting louder now. Not quieter. Words like unnatural and Lord have mercy. And did you ever drifting across the street like smoke? An older woman near the front, someone Colton vaguely recognized from church, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth like she'd seen something indecent. A pair of young men by the saloon door were laughing behind their hands, low and cruel, until Sigrid's gaze cut toward them and the laughing stopped. Freya's shoulders were set so straight they might have been carved from stone. But Colton was close enough now to see the way her hands had curled at her sides. Close enough to see that whatever else she was also exhausted. Bone-deep, soul-deep exhausted. The kind that didn't come from one long stage ride. The kind that came from years of it. "Mr. Hollis," a new voice. Sheriff Dutton, ambling over from the direction of his office. Thumbs hooked in his belt. Taking in the scene with the slow, deliberate suspicion he brought to everything. "Everything all right here?" "Everything's fine, Sheriff." "Don't look fine." Dutton's eyes moved over the 4 sisters with a kind of open, rude appraisal that made Colton's jaw tighten. "Look like something out of a traveling show." "They're my brides," Colton said. Before he'd fully decided to say it, something in him just refused, flatly refused, to let that word hang in the air unanswered. "All 4 of them. Mine and my brother's. So unless you've got actual business here, Sheriff, I'd appreciate you letting us get on with ours." Dutton's eyebrows went up, but he didn't argue, just tipped his hat, slow and unconvinced, and ambled back toward his office, throwing one last look over his shoulder that Colton didn't much care for. The crowd began, gradually, reluctantly, to lose interest and drift back to their business. But the whispers didn't fully die. They just got quieter. Which was somehow worse. Freya watched all of it happen. Watched Colton defend them to the sheriff without missing a beat. Watched the crowd disperse, and something in her face shifted again. Some careful recalculation happening behind those sharp gray eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Do what? Speak for us like that. Seemed like somebody needed to. For a moment, neither of them said anything else. The wind picked up dust from the street and carried it between them, and somewhere behind them, Tate had finally worked up the courage to say something to Liv. Something too quiet for Colton to catch. And Liv had laughed, a real laugh, bright and surprised, like it had escaped before she could stop it. Freya's eyes cut toward the sound, softened just barely, at the sight of her youngest sister laughing on a strange street 1,000 miles from anywhere they'd ever called home. "We should get your things loaded," Colton said. "Ranch is a 2-hour ride from here, Mr. Hollis." Freya's voice stopped him before he could turn away. "Before we go any further, there's something you should know." "All right," she glanced at her sisters. Some silent communication passed between the four of them, quick and practiced, the kind of look that came from people who had learned to read each other in dangerous silences. Sigrid gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not now," that shake said. "Not here." Later, Freya said instead, and Colton had the distinct impression that whatever she'd been about to say had been swallowed back down, tucked away for a moment when fewer strangers were listening. "It can wait until later." "All right," Colton said again, though something in his gut had gone tight and watchful. "Later then." He turned toward the wagon. And behind him, low enough that he almost didn't catch it, he heard Sigrid mutter to her sister, "He doesn't know what he's agreeing to." Freya didn't answer, but her jaw had that same tight set to it, and Colton, loading trunks he hadn't asked to load, found himself wondering exactly what kind of trouble he'd just invited onto his dying ranch. The ride back took most of the afternoon, 2 hours by wagon, longer with 4 extra trunks and 4 passengers, whose combined weight made the old wagon groan on every rut in the road. Colton drove. Freya sat up front beside him, because the others had claimed the back without discussion, the way sisters do, some unspoken hierarchy that put the eldest closest to whoever was steering. They didn't talk much at first. Colton kept his eyes on the road, kept thinking about the word freak hanging in the dusty street air. Kept thinking about the tightness in Freya's shoulders and wondering how many times in her life she'd had to stand in a crowd like that and absorb whatever the crowd decided to throw at her. "You're staring at the road, like it insulted your mother," Freya said finally. Colton blinked. "Didn't realize I was staring at anything in particular. You've got a thinking face." "Your brother back there." She nodded toward the wagon bed, where Reeve was apparently regaling Sigrid with some story that had her arms crossed, and her expression unimpressed, though something in her posture suggested she was listening more closely than she wanted to admit. "He doesn't have a thinking face. He's got a talking face. Never stops moving. That's Reeve, and the quiet one. Reading a book back there like the world isn't happening around him. Abel, he's got a listening face, and Tate?" Freya's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile Colton had seen from her yet. "Tate's got a face that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. Give him 10 years. What about my face told you?" Thinking face, she studied him for a moment, sideways, careful. "You're wondering what I was about to say back there. In town, little bit, you should be." Colton's hands tightened on the reins, just slightly. That an admission or a warning both. She looked out at the passing land, brown hills rolling toward mountains, still capped white despite the season, and something in her expression went distant, tired. "We didn't come here just to escape being alone, Mr. Hollis. There's more to it than that. But I'd rather explain it once, to all of you together, than have to say it twice." "Fair enough." They rode in silence for a while after that. Comfortable, almost. Or as comfortable as silence could be between two strangers who'd just agreed to build a life together, without either one of them fully understanding what that life was going to demand. "Can I ask you something?" Colton said eventually. "You can ask back in town." Somebody in the crowd, they said a word, he didn't repeat it. Didn't want to give it any more air than it had already gotten. "That happen a lot? Where you're from?" Freya's hands, folded in her lap, went very still. "Every day of my life," she said. "Since I was old enough to walk into a room and watch people's faces change," she said it flat, not looking for pity. Just stating a fact the way you'd state the weather. You get used to it. Or you learn to look like you have. Which is it for you? She turned and looked at him then, really looked, gray eyes steady and searching. Like she was trying to decide whether the question was worth an honest answer. Ask me that again in a month, she said. I'll tell you the truth then. Once I know whether you're a man who runs when things get complicated, or one who doesn't. Colton held her gaze. Didn't look away, though something in him wanted to, because there was a weight behind those gray eyes that felt like it could see straight through a person. I don't run, he said. Everyone says that. Freya turned back to the road. Before they know what they're being asked to stay for. They passed a dry creek bed, the kind that only ran in spring, and Freya asked about it. And Colton found himself telling her more than he meant to. About the drought, about how his father used to say, a ranch could survive anything except a man who stopped believing in it. About how he wasn't sure, some mornings, whether he still believed in it himself, or whether he was just too stubborn to admit defeat. She listened. Didn't offer easy comfort, which he found he appreciated more than if she had. Just listened. The way a person listens, who has learned that most trouble doesn't need fixing so much as it needs witnessing. The ranch came into view as the sun started sliding toward the mountains, throwing long gold light across the fields, making even the dead wheat look almost beautiful, almost forgivable. Colton watched Freya take it in. Watched all four sisters, actually. Twisting in the wagon bed, to look at the house, the barn, the corrals, the whole worn and weathered shape of a place that had been fighting to survive for 3 years straight. It's not much, Colton said, before he could stop himself. I know it's not much. It's a home, Freya said quietly. We haven't had one of those in a long time. Something about the way she said it made Colton's chest ache, in a way he wasn't prepared for. Didn't know her story. Not yet, not really. But he knew exhaustion when he heard it, and he knew what it cost a person to keep standing after years of not having anywhere safe to stand. They pulled up to the house as the light went gold and long. Tate practically leapt down from the wagon to help Liv with her trunk, nearly toppling over his own boots in the process, and Liv laughed again, that same bright, startled sound, and caught his arm before he could go down entirely. Careful, she said. I'm always careful. You just tripped over air. That was intentional. Reeve helped Sigrid down with a flourish that earned him an unimpressed look and, Colton noted, the faintest ghost of a smile, that Sigrid tried very hard to hide. Abel offered his hand to Ingrid, and she took it carefully, still clutching that cloth bundle, to her chest with her other arm, and something passed between them. Quiet and curious, the two of them already sizing each other up, like people who recognize something familiar in one another. And Colton turned to help Freya down, though she clearly didn't need the help, her own strength evident in the easy way she'd climbed in and out of that wagon all day. But she took his offered hand anyway, just for a moment. Just long enough that Colton felt the strength in her grip, real and undeniable, and something else underneath it. Something that might have been gratitude for the gesture, even though it wasn't strictly necessary. Welcome to the Hollis place, Colton said. Freya looked up at the house, at the porch where his father used to sit, at the mountains behind it going purple and gold in the dying light. Thank you, she said, and then, quieter, almost to herself, let's hope it stays welcoming. Supper that first night was awkward in the way first suppers, with strangers always are. Too much silence. Too many polite questions about the journey. Too many careful glances exchanged between 8 people who didn't yet know each other's rhythms, crowded around a table that had, until that morning, only ever needed to seat 4. Freya had insisted on helping in the kitchen, despite protests that she was a guest and shouldn't have to lift a finger her first night. She'd looked at Colton like he'd said something faintly ridiculous. I've been cooking for my sisters since I was 12 years old, Mr. Hollis. I don't know how to sit idle in a kitchen. It'd feel like betraying the room. The meal itself was simple. Stew, bread gone slightly stale. A jar of preserves that had been saved for an occasion nobody had quite expected to arrive. Conversation moved in fits and starts. 4 brothers and 4 sisters testing the shape of each other across a crowded table. Careful the way strangers are careful, feeling out where the sharp edges might be, Tate, predictably, filled most of the silences that threatened to stretch too long, asking Liv a stream of questions about Boston, about the ocean, about whether it was true the buildings there went up 5 and 6 stories, until Sigrid finally told him to let the poor girl eat. Abel asked Ingrid about the cloth bundle she'd carried so carefully the whole journey and watched her face light, with something shy and pleased when she admitted quietly that it held sketching supplies, nothing valuable, just something that had been hers before everything else had been taken. Reeve tried 3 separate jokes on Sigrid over the course of the meal. She met the first with science, the second with a flat stare, and the third, despite herself, with the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth that she covered immediately by reaching for her water glass. Freya and Colton spoke the least of anyone, both of them watching the room more than participating in it, the way people do when they're carrying a weight nobody else at the table can see. After the meal, after the dishes, after the house had finally settled into the particular quiet of 8 tired strangers retreating to separate rooms, Colton found himself back out on the porch, alone. Or he thought he was alone, until he heard the door creak behind him and turned to find Freya stepping out into the cool night air, a shawl pulled around her shoulders despite the size that meant it barely covered anything at all. Couldn't sleep? Colton asked. New house, new sounds. She leaned against the porch rail, close enough to him that he caught the faint scent of wood smoke and travel dust still clinging to her hair. Old habit. When you spend enough nights not knowing if you're safe, you learn to listen to everything before you can rest. You're safe here. You don't know that yet. She said it without accusation. Just fact again, the same flat honesty she'd used earlier. You don't know what you've agreed to protect. Colton turned to face her fully. Then tell me. Freya was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark shapes of the mountains against a sky gone thick with stars. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped low, careful, like each word cost her something to hand over. Our father was an inventor, she said, back in Boston. Good man. Brilliant, in his way. Had a partner named Augustus Renwick. Her jaw tightened around the name, the way a person's jaw tightens around something bitter. Renwick wanted what our father built. And when father wouldn't sell it to him, Renwick found another way to take it. It wasn't just the invention, Freya said. Father's work was in structural engineering, bridges, load-bearing designs. Renwick understood better than anyone that a woman built like me, like my sisters, could do the work of 3 men without tiring. He didn't see daughters when he looked at us, Mr. Hollis. He saw labor he hadn't yet found a way to own. What happened? Father died. 3 words, flat and final, but Colton heard everything underneath them, everything she wasn't saying yet. And Renwick decided the 4 of us were part of what he was owed. Colton felt something cold settle in his stomach. Owed how? Freya turned to look at him then, and in the moonlight, her face was carved from something harder than exhaustion. Something like old fear, worn smooth by years of carrying it. You'll understand more when the time comes, Mr. Hollis, she said. For now, just know this. We didn't come out here looking for husbands because we were lonely. Her eyes held his, steady, unflinching. We came because we ran out of places to hide. The wind moved through the porch eaves. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called out, distant and lonesome. And neither of them said anything, for a long moment after. You're safe here, Colton said again, quieter this time, meaning it more than he had the first time he'd said it. I don't know what all of this means yet. But I meant what I told the sheriff today. You're mine to look after now. All 4 of you. Something flickered across Freya's face. Not quite trust, not yet. But something reaching toward it, tentative, like a hand extended over a gap it wasn't sure would hold weight. We'll see, Mr. Hollis, she said softly. We'll see. She didn't linger after that. Said goodnight, quiet and formal, and went inside to the room she shared with her sisters, leaving Colton alone on the porch with the wind and the stars and a growing certainty that whatever he'd agreed to when he sealed that letter 6 weeks ago, it had been considerably larger than a request for a wife. He stayed out there a long while, turning the name Renwick over in his mind, Try to imagine what kind of man could make a woman as strong as Freya Nordahl look, even for a moment like she was still running. He didn't come up with an answer that night, but he made himself a promise, sitting alone in the cold, that whatever was coming, it would have to go through him first. The days that followed settled into something like rhythm, though calling it comfortable would have been generous. 8 people in a house built for 4, made for constant small collisions, elbows in doorways, 2 people reaching for the same skillet at the same moment. Tate nearly walking face first into a door frame 3 separate times in 1 week. Because Liv had a way of appearing in rooms without him hearing her coming, which, given her size, should have been impossible, and yet somehow never was. Freya took over the kitchen within 2 days, and the change was immediate. Bread that actually rose. Stew that had real seasoning in it, instead of just salt and desperation. Abel, who'd been doing most of the cooking since their mother passed, watched her work with something between relief and mild professional jealousy. "She's better at this than I ever was," he admitted to Colton one evening, watching through the kitchen window as Freya moved between the stove and the table, with an efficiency that spoke of years running a household on her own. "Kitchen hasn't smelled like that since Ma was alive." "Don't let her hear you say that. She'll think we only want her for the cooking, do we not?" Colton didn't answer that one, because the truth was getting complicated in ways he hadn't expected, and he wasn't ready to examine it too closely yet. Ingrid, it turned out, had a gift that revealed itself slowly. Colton noticed it first, when he found Abel sitting across from her, at the kitchen table one evening. Both of them bent over a piece of paper, and when he leaned in to look, he found not writing but drawing. Intricate patterns, geometric and beautiful, the kind of thing that belonged in a proper Boston parlor rather than a rough-hewn ranch kitchen. "What's that?" Colton asked. "Quilt pattern," Ingrid said, not looking up, cheeks going faintly pink at the attention. "Something to pass the evenings." "It's remarkable," Abel said, and there was something in his voice that made Colton glance between the two of them with new interest. Abel wasn't a man who threw words like remarkable around lightly. "It's just foolishness," Ingrid murmured. "A way to keep my hands busy." "It's not foolishness." Abel's voice had gone soft in a way Colton had rarely heard from his careful, measured brother. "It's the first beautiful thing I've seen in this house in 3 years." Ingrid's blush deepened, and she bent lower over her drawing. But Colton caught the small, pleased smile she was trying to hide, and filed it away. Over the following weeks, Abel started bringing her things. A book of pressed wildflowers he'd found in their mother's old trunk. A length of good cloth he'd traded for at the mercantile. Unable to fully explain to Cassidy Marsh why he suddenly cared about fabric quality. He'd sit across from her some evenings, reading while she drew, the two of them content in a shared silence that neither seemed inclined to break, and Colton began to understand that his quiet, careful brother had found, in this quiet, careful woman, something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Sigrid and Reeve, meanwhile, had fallen into a rhythm of their own, though calling it peaceful would have been a stretch. It was more war than romance. Reeve tried every charm in his considerable arsenal, and Sigrid deflected every single one with the precision of a woman who'd had a great deal of practice deflecting men who thought. Charm was the same thing as substance. A woman's touch does improve a place. Reeve said one morning, gesturing at the newly scrubbed table with theatrical appreciation. A man's effort in that barn would improve it more. Sigrid shot back, not even looking up from the dough she was kneading, with a focused intensity that suggested the dough had personally wronged her. But Colton noticed things. Noticed how Reeve started leaving small offerings on the porch rail. A particularly good piece of jerky, a wildflower that had somehow survived the drought, and how Sigrid pretended not to notice them, while somehow always finding a way to make them disappear. Noticed the way her sharp eyes softened, just slightly. Whenever she watched Reeve wrestling with some ranch chore he clearly didn't fully understand, giving instructions in that same fast talking face manner she'd flagged in Colton the second day. One afternoon, Reeve came in from the corral, limping slightly, having been unceremoniously thrown by a horse he'd sworn he had under control and Sigrid, without a word, without even pausing her sharp commentary on his general competence, took his arm and set the bone in his wrist that had bent wrong in the fall, her enormous hands surprisingly gentle, for something capable of such obvious strength. Reeve had gone pale and quiet through the whole procedure, and afterward, sitting at the kitchen table with his wrist properly splinted, he'd looked at her with something new in his eyes. "You didn't even flinch," he said. "Neither did you. Mostly, I flinched plenty. Just did it quiet. That's the only kind of flinching that counts for anything," Sigrid said. And there was something almost gentle underneath the sharpness of her tone. And Reeve, watching her walk away, had the distinct sense that he was in a great deal more trouble than a broken wrist. And Tate and Liv. Tate and Liv needed no help at all. They found their footing easiest of anyone, falling into an easy companionship built on simple things: milking the cow, mending fences. Liv teaching Tate the names of stars from a book she'd carried all the way from Boston. The two of them lying on their backs in the dead grass, some evenings, tracing constellations, while the rest of the household pretended not to watch through the windows with fond, worried eyes. Because it was easy for the youngest ones, because they hadn't yet learned all the ways the world could take something good and ruin it. Because Liv's laughter, bright and unguarded, had started echoing across the ranch yard in a way that made even Colton's chest feel less tight when he heard it. It was Colton and Freya who struggled hardest to find their rhythm. Because they were the ones carrying the weight. Because every conversation between them turned practical almost immediately, brisk and businesslike. Two people managing a household instead of two people trying to build a life. "We'll need more flour before the week's out," Freya would say. "I'll see to it," Colton would answer. "The east fence needs mending." "I'm aware." Short, clipped, efficient, and underneath every exchange, something neither of them said out loud. Something that lived in the careful way they avoided standing too close. In the way Colton found himself watching her across the supper table, more than he meant to. In the way Freya's eyes would catch his sometimes, and hold a beat too long before she looked away. One evening, after the others had gone to bed, Colton found her alone by the hearth, firelight throwing long shadows across her face, and for once the careful composure she wore like armor had slipped just a little. Just enough that Colton could see the exhaustion underneath it. The fear she kept so carefully hidden during daylight hours. "You can't keep carrying it alone," he said, sitting across from her. "Carrying what? Whatever it is you're not telling us. About Renwick. About why you're really here." Freya's eyes came up to his, and for a moment, something raw moved across her face. "You don't understand what you're asking, Mr. Hollis. Then help me understand. If I tell you everything," she said slowly, "you might send us away, and we have nowhere else to go." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last words, the first real crack Colton had seen in her since the stage platform. "We spent every dollar we had getting here. This is the last chance we have." Colton felt something shift in his chest, something protective and fierce that surprised him with its intensity. "I'm not going to send you away," he said. "But I need to know what we're up against. If this Renwick comes looking for you, I need to know how to protect this family." All 8 of us now. Freya studied him for a long moment. Studied him the way she had that first afternoon on the wagon. Like she was trying to read something true underneath his words. "1 month, she said finally. "Give us 1 month to prove ourselves, to prove this can work. And when the time is right, I'll tell you everything. I promise you that." Colton wanted to push. Wanted to demand the whole truth, right then, sitting there in the dying firelight, with the weight of her fear hanging heavy in the room between them. But something in her face stopped him. Some understanding that trust wasn't a thing you could demand from a person who'd spent her whole life being looked at like a monster. 1 month, he agreed. She let out a breath. Something between relief and exhaustion, and, for just a moment, just a flicker, Colton saw something like gratitude in her eyes that made his chest ache in a way he still wasn't ready to name. "Can I ask you something else?" Colton said after a while. "You can ask your father. What was he like?" Something softened in Freya's face, the exhaustion giving way just briefly to something warmer. Patient, she said, endlessly patient. He used to say that a good design was just a problem that had been listened to carefully enough. He built us a swing once, out behind the house in Boston, reinforced it 3 separate times, because the first 2 designs couldn't hold our weight. Never once complained about it, just kept adjusting. Kept listening to what the wood was telling him. Sounds like a good man. He was the best man I ever knew. Her voice caught, just slightly. Which is, I think, part of why Renwick hated him so much. Goodness like that, it makes small men feel smaller, just by standing near it. Colton thought about his own father then, about the way the old man had carried this ranch, through droughts and hard winters without ever once raising his voice in anger, at land that refused to cooperate. My father used to say a ranch teaches you patience, or it teaches you nothing at all, he said. Guess yours taught you something similar, just with different tools. Freya looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. You're an easy man to talk to, Colton Hollis, she said. I didn't expect that. Didn't expect much of anything good, if I'm honest. What did you expect? A stranger, a hard bargain. Somebody who'd take one look at us on that platform and decide we were more trouble than we were worth. She shook her head slowly. I've been braced for that my whole life. Hadn't quite worked out what to do with someone who wasn't. Still working it out? Still working it out, she agreed. And there was the ghost of a smile there, small but real. And Colton found himself thinking about it long after she'd said goodnight and gone to bed. The weeks that followed brought a fragile kind of peace. The household found its footing. Slowly, meals became less awkward. Conversation stretched longer, laughter came easier, and the ranch itself seemed to respond to the change. Or maybe that was just Colton's imagination, wanting so badly for sequin things to be getting better that he saw improvement everywhere he looked. There were small moments of grace scattered through those weeks that Colton would remember long after. Moments that had nothing to do with Renwick or debt or fear. Freya teaching Tate how to properly braid a rope, her enormous hands guiding his smaller ones with a patience that surprised him. Ingrid's quilt patterns slowly filling a corner of the parlor with color, the first real decoration the house had seen since their mother died. Sigrid, against every instinct in her body, letting Reeve talk her into a single dance in the kitchen one evening, while Abel hummed something that might have been a tune, the whole scene so absurd and so tender that Colton had to leave the room before anyone saw the look on his face. But there were moments, small ones, moments that reminded everyone the peace was fragile. Like the day Colton rode into Promise Ridge for supplies and came back to find the whole household tense and quiet, Freya's face pale in a way he hadn't seen since that first day on the platform. What happened? He asked. Nothing, Freya said, too quickly. Just tired. But Ingrid's hands were shaking as she folded laundry, and Sigrid's jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with kneading dough. And Colton knew, with the certainty of a man who'd learned to read the weather, on this land his whole life, that a storm was coming even if he couldn't see it yet. It came 3 days later. A letter arrived at the ranch, addressed not to any of the Hollis brothers, but to Miss E. Nordahl, care of the Hollis Ranch, Promise Ridge, Montana Territory, postmarked Boston. Colton brought it back from town himself, and he watched Freya's face go through half a dozen expressions the moment she saw the handwriting on the envelope. She retreated to the room she shared with her sisters. And the mood in that house shifted so fast, so completely, that Colton felt it in his own chest before he even knew what had happened. He waited on the porch, waited until the sun went down and the house went quiet, until Freya finally came to find him. Letter still clutched in her hand, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight. It's from a friend, she said before he could ask. Someone we left behind in Boston. She promised to write if anything changed, and something changed. Freya's hand trembled just slightly as she unfolded the letter. A man's been asking questions, all over our old neighborhood. Hired detective. Pinkerton Agency. Her voice caught. He didn't give a name, but he mentioned us by name. Asked about father's business affairs. Asked where we'd gone. Colton felt his stomach drop. Renwick, it has to be. Freya's eyes came up to his, wide and frightened in a way that made something fierce and protective roar to life in Colton's chest. "He's found us, Mr. Hollis. Or he's close to it. And when he comes," she didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The fear in her voice said everything the words couldn't. Colton stood, crossed the porch, stopped close enough that he could see every line of exhaustion and terror etched into her face. Close enough that the careful distance they'd been keeping between them for weeks suddenly felt impossibly small. "Let him come," Colton said. And his voice came out harder than he'd expected, harder and more certain than anything he'd said since the day his father died. "This ranch has stood through drought and debt, and every kind of ruin the territory's thrown at it. It can stand against one man from Boston, too." Freya's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie in it, the doubt, the hesitation that would tell her he didn't mean what he was saying. She didn't find any. "You don't know him," she whispered. "You don't know what he's capable of. Then teach me." Colton's hand found hers, careful, tentative, and she let him take it, her fingers curling around his with a strength that spoke of every hardship she'd survived to get here. "Because I'm not letting anyone take this family apart. Not after everything it's taken to build it." The wind moved through the yard, carrying the scent of the mountains and the coming autumn, and, somewhere in the dark, Colton heard the soft murmur of the other sisters talking low in their room. Heard Liv's voice pitched gentle, comforting, and the sound of it, the whole strange fragile shape of this new family he'd found himself building, settled something in his chest that had been unsettled for 3 long years. Freya looked up at him, and for the first time she'd stepped down off that stage, Colton saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear. It looked almost like hope. But even as he stood there holding her hand in the moonlight, even as something warm and dangerous bloomed in his chest, Colton couldn't shake the cold certainty settling low in his stomach. Because whoever Augustus Renwick was, whatever he'd done to this family already, the letter in Freya's trembling hand meant one thing above all else: he was coming, and whatever peace they'd built in these few short weeks, whatever fragile thing had started growing between two people who barely knew each other yet, couldn't stop reaching toward one another anyway. None of it would matter unless the Hollis Ranch was ready for what walked through its gate next. Somewhere out past the dark tree line, a wolf howled, long and lonesome, and Freya's hand tightened around his. "1 month," she whispered again, like a promise she was making to herself as much as to him. "We asked for 1 month. I don't think we're going to get it." She was right. The letter came again on a Sunday, and this time it wasn't from Boston. It was from Merchants Trust. Hand-delivered by a boy on a mule who didn't wait around for a reply, who just dropped the envelope in Colton's hand and turned that mule around like he'd been told not to linger. Colton read it standing in the yard. Read it twice. Because the first time through, his mind refused to accept what the words were telling him. And the second time through didn't change a single one of them. The note on the Hollis Ranch had been sold. Purchased outright by a Mr. Augustus Renwick of Boston, Massachusetts. Full balance due within 30 days. Or the bank, now acting on behalf of the new note holder, would proceed with foreclosure. 30 days. Colton stood there in the dust, with that paper shaking in his hand, and something cold moved through him. Not fear exactly. Fear was too small a word. This was something closer to watching a wave come in from a long way off, and knowing with total certainty that there was nowhere left to run. "Colt," Freya's voice from the porch. She'd seen his face. She always saw his face now, faster than his brothers did, faster than anyone had in a long time. "What is it?" He walked up the steps. Handed her the letter without a word, because there weren't words yet, not ones that wouldn't come out shaking. She read it. And Colton watched her go very still, the particular stillness of a person who recognizes an enemy's handwriting, even when the enemy hasn't signed his name to it himself. "He didn't send men," she said quietly. "He sent money. Same thing, coming from him?" "Worse." Freya's hand tightened on the paper until it crumpled at the edges. "Men, you can fight. Money buys the law before you even know. There's a fight coming. By supper, the whole household knew. 8 people around a table that had, in the weeks since the wedding party arrived, become something close to a real family table. Now it sat heavy with a silence that had nothing comfortable in it. 30 days, Abel said, staring at the ledger he'd already reopened, pen hovering over numbers that hadn't gotten any kinder since the last time he'd added them up. We were already going to struggle to make the October payment. Now he's moved the whole debt up and doubled the pressure, because that's what he does. Freya's voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed, staying calm because the alternative was screaming, and screaming had never once solved anything in her life. He did the same thing to Father, bought out his creditors one by one until Father had nowhere left to turn but him. And then what? Tate asked. Quiet, for once. No grin on his face tonight. Freya didn't answer right away. Her eyes went to the window, to the dark shape of the mountains beyond it, and Colton saw her hands curl into fists in her lap. And then Father died, she said. And Renwick got everything he wanted anyway. Sigrid's jaw was tight enough to crack walnuts. Ingrid had gone pale, her fingers white-knuckled around her fork. And Liv had reached for Tate's hand under the table without seeming to realize she'd done it, and Tate hadn't pulled away. He's not getting this ranch, Colton said. Quiet, certain. The kind of certain that didn't leave room for argument. And he's not getting you for, either. I don't care what it costs. You don't know what it costs. Freya's eyes came up to his, and for a moment the fear underneath her composure showed through, raw and unguarded. That's the whole point, Colton. You don't know what he's willing to spend to get what he wants. Money, reputations, lives. Then we find out together. Something passed between them across that table. Something that had been building for weeks, quiet and unspoken. And for just a second it felt like the whole room fell away. And there was only the two of them, staring at each other over a debt neither of them had asked for. And a danger neither of them had chosen. Reeve cleared his throat. Loud. Deliberate, as moving as this is, he said. We still owe $400 we don't have, and now we owe it faster. Anybody got a plan besides staring meaningfully at each other? Colton broke the gaze first. Felt his ears go hot, which was a ridiculous thing to feel at a moment like this, and hated himself a little for feeling it anyway. We work, he said, every hand on this ranch, every day, until the note's paid or the 30 days run out. Whichever comes first, and if the 30 days run out first. Nobody answered that one. Because nobody had an answer. And the silence that followed sat in that kitchen, like a living thing, breathing, waiting. They threw themselves into the work anyway. There was nothing else to do with the fear except turn it into labor. Colton and his brothers worked the herd from dawn until the light failed, trying to fatten what stock they could for early sale, while the sisters took on the household and the garden, and increasingly, tasks nobody had asked them to take on, simply because there was work to be done, and 8 hands were better than 4. Freya proved in those weeks to have a head for numbers nearly as sharp as Abel's, and the two of them spent long evenings bent over the ledger together, finding small economies nobody else had thought of, stretching a dwindling strong box as far as it could reasonably go. It wasn't going to be enough. Everyone at that table understood that, without needing to say it aloud, but it was something. And something, in those days, felt like more than they'd had before. Word travels fast in a small territory. Faster than a man can outrun it, faster than the truth can usually keep pace with the rumor. By the following week, Promise Ridge had a new favorite subject, and the Hollis Ranch was at the center of it. Colton heard the first version from Cassidy Marsh, who pulled him aside at the Mercantile, with the careful, apologetic manner of a man about to deliver bad news he didn't want to be blamed for. Fella came through town, Cassidy said, keeping his voice low, glancing toward the door, like he expected eavesdroppers, well-dressed, city manners, asking questions all over. About your wives, mostly. About where they came from. What kind of questions? The kind that don't sound friendly, Colt. He's been saying things, that they're dangerous, unnatural, that folks ought to be careful having creatures like that living so close to town. Cassidy's mouth twisted with distaste, his word. Not mine. Something hot and furious moved through Colton's chest. Who is he? Didn't give a name to me. but he's staying at the hotel, paying for drinks all over the saloon, buying goodwill, same as he's buying gossip. Cassidy shook his head. Half the town's already talking like your family's harboring something out of a traveling freak show. Colton's hands curled into fists at his sides. Thank you, Cassidy. Just be careful, Colt. Man like that, spending money like water. He's not here for a friendly visit. Colton already knew that. Had known it since the letter arrived from Merchants Trust, with Renwick's name signed at the bottom, like a promise of worse things to come. The rumors grew teeth over the following days. Colton heard them everywhere he went. In the Mercantile, where two women stopped talking the moment he walked in, their faces doing that particular kind of guilty flush that told him exactly what they'd been discussing. At the feed store, where the owner made an excuse about being low on stock rather than serve him, an excuse that fooled nobody, least of all Colton. At church on the one Sunday, the whole family made the trip into town together. Half the congregation found urgent reasons to be somewhere else the moment the Nordahl sisters walked through the door. Pews that had been full a month ago suddenly had gaps around where the family sat. Colton watched Freya endure it, watched her spine stay straight, her chin stay level, even as whispers hissed around her like snakes in dry grass. Watched Liv's face crumple, just slightly, before she caught herself and smoothed it back into careful neutrality. Watched Sigrid's hands ball into fists in her lap, knuckles white, jaw working like she was chewing on words she wasn't allowed to say out loud in a house of God. After the service, Sheriff Dutton found Colton on the church steps. His expression was carefully neutral, in a way that told Colton it was about to be anything but good news. There's a petition going around, Dutton said. Some of the townsfolk concerned about, and I'm quoting here, unnatural dangers living so close to decent families. That's insane, might be. Dutton's eyes were tired, and Colton realized with something like surprise that the man didn't actually agree with what he was saying. He was just the messenger, and he didn't like the job. But insane don't matter much once enough names get put to paper. Fella funding, the whole thing well-dressed city manners, calls himself their concerned benefactor. Says he's trying to protect the town from a danger it doesn't understand. Colton's blood went cold. Renwick didn't give me a name outright, but that description fits a man been throwing money around town all week. He's not protecting anybody. He's trying to run them out of Promise Ridge so he can get to them easier. Maybe so. Dutton pulled his hat down lower against the sun. But a man with money and a story folks want to believe. He doesn't need to be right, Colt. He just needs enough people scared. He hesitated. You'd best be careful. All of you. Man like that, he doesn't stop at rumors when rumors don't work fast enough. He walked away before Colton could ask what that was supposed to mean. That evening, Colton told the family everything Dutton had said, watched the fear settle over the table like a physical weight. Freya, though, seemed less surprised than the others. This is how he works, she said quietly. He did the same thing to Father's business partners. Isolate, turn opinion, make sure that by the time he arrives himself, there's nobody left willing to stand against him. Her hands were steady, but her voice carried an old, tired dread. Rumors are just the opening move, Colton. If they don't work fast enough, he escalates. Escalates how? Freya didn't answer that question directly, just looked at him, something haunted moving behind her eyes, and said only, "You should double the watch on the barn tonight." He found out what she meant 3 nights later. It started with the horses. Colton woke to the sound of screaming animals, not human screaming. Worse in its way, because horses don't scream unless something is genuinely, mortally wrong, and every man who'd ever worked a ranch knew that sound down in his bones. He was out of bed and pulling boots on, before he was even fully awake, grabbing his rifle off the wall on instinct alone. And by the time he hit the porch, the whole household was stirring behind him, doors banging, voices calling out in the dark. Fire! Tate's voice from somewhere near the barn. Colt, the barn's on fire! Colton ran. Ran hard across the yard, the night air full of smoke and screaming horses, and the roaring crackle of flame eating dry wood, and when he got close enough to see, his stomach dropped straight through the ground. The barn was burning. Not slow. Not accidental. Fire had been set at 3 separate corners, which meant somebody had walked around that barn in the dark with a torch, deliberate and methodical, meaning to make sure the whole structure caught before anyone could stop it. Get the horses out. Colton was already moving toward the burning doors, smoke billowing thick and choking, when a shape moved in the dark at the tree line. A man. Then another. Then a third. All of them mounted. All of them watching the fire they'd set with the patient, satisfied stillness of men who'd been paid well do exactly this. "Colt, get down," Abel's voice. And then the crack of a rifle shot splitting the night. And Colton felt something tear through his shoulder like a hot iron rod, spinning him half around before his legs buckled, and the ground came up fast to meet him. He heard Freya scream his name. Heard it the way you hear things underwater, muffled and far away and wrong. And then there were hands on him, enormous and strong and shaking, hauling him up and back away from the fire, and the shooting and the men on horseback who were already wheeling their mounts to ride down on the burning yard. Colton, Freya's face above his, lit orange by firelight, terror stripped raw across every feature. "Colton, stay with me, I'm..." He tried to sit up. Pain exploded through his shoulder, white and blinding, and he went back down hard. "I'm fine. You are not fine, you absolute fool. You've been shot." Another rifle crack. Closer this time. Freya's whole body went rigid over him, shielding him without seeming to think about it at all. Just instinct, pure and immediate. And Colton heard the bullet whine past, close enough to feel the air move. And then something in Freya changed. Colton would try, later, to find the words for what he watched happen next. And he would never quite manage it. Because what he saw wasn't rage exactly, and it wasn't fear either, though it had roots in both. What he saw was something ancient. Something that had been leashed and controlled and hidden away for years, finally let loose. Freya stood, 6.5 feet, a fury silhouetted against burning barnwood. And when the nearest gunman wheeled his horse toward her, rifle already rising to his shoulder, she didn't run, didn't flinch. Didn't do a single thing that made sense for a woman, facing down an armed man on horseback in the middle of the night. She caught the horse's bridle with one hand as it came at her, stopped it. Stopped a full-grown horse, and its rider dead in its tracks like she'd caught nothing more than a child's toy. And the animal screamed and reared, and the gunman went flying from the saddle. And before he'd even hit the ground, Freya had closed the distance and torn the rifle from his hands, like it weighed nothing at all. "Get off this land," she said. Her voice didn't rise, didn't need to. It carried across that burning yard like the crack of doom itself. "Get off this land, or I promise you, whatever Renwick is paying you, it is not enough." The second gunman fired at her. Colton, still on the ground, still bleeding, still fighting to stay conscious, watched the shot go wide as Freya moved, faster than something her size had any right to move, and closed the distance between herself and the second horse. In 3 strides that ate up ground like it was nothing, she grabbed the man by his collar, pulled him bodily from the saddle, and threw him, actually threw him, 10 feet through the smoky dark air, and he landed hard in the dirt and didn't get up right away. And the third gunman, watching all of this unfold, apparently decided that whatever he was being paid wasn't worth what he was witnessing, and wheeled his horse around and fled into the dark without firing another shot. The barn continued to burn. But the attack was over, and in the sudden ringing silence that followed, Colton lay in the dirt, with his shoulder on fire, and watched Freya Nordahl stand in the middle of the yard, chest heaving, hands shaking, now that the danger had passed, looking around at the mess of burning wood and fleeing horses, and 2 unconscious gunmen. Like she couldn't quite believe what she'd just done in front of God and everybody. Because she'd never let anyone see the full truth of what she was. Not like this. Not in the open, not unrestrained, not with witnesses, and now every single person on that ranch had seen it, Freya. Colton's voice came out, cracked and rough. "Freya, I need..." She was at his side before he finished the sentence. Down on her knees in the dirt, hands hovering over his shoulder like she was afraid to touch him and afraid not to. "Don't you dare," she said, voice shaking now. All that terrible, controlled calm finally cracking wide open. "Don't you dare die on me?" Colton Hollis. "Not after everything. Not planning on it," Colton managed. And the words came out half a laugh, half a groan of pain. "Little busy being shot right now. This is not the time for jokes. Might be the only time," he said. And then the world went gray and soft at the edges. And the last thing he felt before the dark took him was Freya's enormous trembling hands pressing hard against the wound in his shoulder, and her voice breaking now, saying his name over and over like a prayer. He woke to lamplight and pain, and Abel's face hovering somewhere above him, pale and drawn. "There he is," Abel's voice, tight with relief. "Thought we might lose you there for a while, brother." "Barn," Colton croaked. "Gone." "Total loss." Abel's jaw tightened. "But the horses got out. All of them." "That's something." Colton tried to sit up. Failed. Every part of his shoulder screamed protest at the attempt, and he sank back into the pillow with a groan that wasn't entirely from the pain. "How long?" 2 days. 2. Colton's eyes went wide. 2 days? What happened? Who? "Slow down." Abel's hand pressed gently but firmly against his uninjured shoulder, holding him still. "You lost a lot of blood. Doc Weathers came out from town, dug the bullet out. Said you'd live if you didn't do anything foolish like try to get up before you healed." A pause. "Which, knowing you, was always the real gamble." "The men who did it." Abel's expression darkened. "One of them talked. Once Sheriff Dutton got him alone. Confirmed what we already suspected. Hired hands. Paid to burn us out, scare us bad enough to run. And if that didn't work..." He didn't finish the sentence. "Didn't need to, Renwick. Renwick." Abel's voice was hard now. Harder than Colton had ever heard from his meshed brother. "Dutton's got enough now to bring formal charges. Attempted murder, arson, conspiracy. But Renwick's smart, Colt. He'll have distanced himself from the men who actually pulled the triggers. Paid them through some agent, some middleman. So there's no direct line back to him." Colton closed his eyes, felt the exhaustion of it settle into his bones alongside the pain. "Freya," he said. "Where is she?" "Hasn't left your side in 2 days, if you want the honest truth. We had to practically drag her away to eat." Something softened in Abel's expression. "She's out on the porch now. 3rd time today I've seen her go out there. I think she needs air more than she needs rest. Send her in." "Colt, please, Abel." His brother studied him for a moment, something knowing in his gaze, and then nodded and slipped out of the room without another word. Freya came in a few minutes later, and the sight of her stopped Colton's heart in a way the gunshot hadn't managed. She looked wrecked. Dark circles under her eyes, hair coming loose from its braid, hands raw and scraped from 2 days of nursing and worrying and not sleeping. But underneath the exhaustion was something else. Something that looked, to Colton's aching heart, almost like shame. "You're awake," she said, standing just inside the doorway, like she wasn't sure she had the right to come any closer. "Come here," she hesitated. "Freya, come here." She crossed the room slowly, sank into the chair beside his bed, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all, just looked at him with an expression Colton couldn't quite read. "You saw," she said finally, quiet, almost afraid, "what I am, what I can really do. When I stopped holding it back, I saw you save my life. I saw you look at me differently. I looked at you like a man." "Watches a miracle happen right in front of him," Colton said, and his voice came out rough, thick with something he hadn't let himself say yet. "Freya, you threw a grown man 10 feet like he weighed nothing. You stopped a charging horse with one hand, and the whole time, all I could think about, lying there bleeding in the dirt, was that I'd never in my whole life seen anything as strong or as brave as you were in that yard." Her eyes filled, sudden and unexpected, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth like she could hold the emotion in by force. "Everyone's always been afraid of what I am," she whispered. "My whole life. Even people who claimed to love me. There was always this line, this careful distance, like I might snap and hurt somebody if I forgot myself for even a moment. I'm not afraid of you. You should be a little afraid of me," she said. And there was a broken kind of laugh underneath the words. "I threw a man 10 feet, Colton. He was trying to burn my barn down and kill my family. Seems like exactly the kind of man who deserved throwing. That surprised a real laugh out of her, wet and startled, and she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, and for a moment the terrible tension in the room eased just slightly. "I thought I'd lost you," she said, quieter now. "Lying there in the dirt, bleeding, and I couldn't." Her voice broke. "I've spent my whole life protecting my sisters, being strong so they didn't have to be. And in that moment, watching you go down, I understood for the first time what it actually costs to love somebody enough to be terrified of losing them." Colton reached out with his good arm, found her hand, still raw and scraped from days of nursing him, and held it as tight as his weakened grip would allow. "You're not going to lose me," he said. "Takes more than one bullet to put a Hollis down for good. Don't you dare joke about this, Freya." He waited until her eyes came up to meet his, held them steady, made sure she heard every word that came next. "I fell in love with you somewhere between that stage platform and this bed. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it happened. And no gunman Renwick hires, no fire he sets. None of it changes that." She stared at him, tears spilling freely now, and then she leaned down, carefully, mindful of his injured shoulder, and pressed her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, I do." Outside the window, the sun was setting over the burned skeleton of what used to be their barn, painting the sky in colors too beautiful for a day that had held so much fear in it. And inside that small bedroom, two people who'd started as strangers held on to each other like the whole world depended on it. Because Colton was beginning to understand, it very well might. Sheriff Dutton rode out to the ranch 4 days later, and the look on his face told Colton this wasn't a social call. "Got something you need to see," Dutton said, dismounting slow, a leather satchel tucked under one arm. "Might want the whole family for this one." They gathered in the kitchen. All 8 of them, Colton still moving carefully, his arm in a sling. Freya hovering close beside him in a way she'd started doing since the fire. Protective and unwilling to let much distance grow between them, Dutton set the satchel on the table, pulled out a stack of papers, worn and yellowed at the edges, and Colton watched Freya's face go pale the moment she saw them. "Those are," she started. "Your father's business papers," Dutton said. "Some of them, anyway. Pinkerton agent I've been in contact with, fella named Cobb, tracked these down through an old associate of your father's in Boston. Man's been sitting on them for years, too scared of Renwick to come forward."
"Scared how?"
Colton asked. Dutton's expression darkened. "Because these papers, once you get through the legal language, they tell a different story than the one Renwick's been putting out for years. Story where your father wasn't just a business partner who ran into hard luck." He tapped the stack. "Story where Renwick systematically ruined him. Bought out every creditor, poisoned every business relationship, made sure your father had nowhere left to turn." Freya's hands were shaking. "We knew that. We've always known that. There's more." Dutton pulled one final document from the bottom of the stack, and his jaw tightened as he set it down. "This is a statement. Sworn, notarized. From a man who used to work for Renwick directly. Says he was present the night your father died. Says it wasn't the accident everyone was told it was." The kitchen went utterly silent. "What are you saying?" Freya's voice had gone very small. "I'm saying," Dutton said slowly, carefully, like a man handling something that might explode, "that according to this statement, your father's death wasn't an accident at all. It was arranged. On Renwick's orders. To clear the last obstacle standing between him and everything your father had built." Sigrid made a sound like she'd been struck. Ingrid's hands flew to her mouth. Liv had gone white as bone, and Tate's arm came around her instantly, holding her up. And Freya stood very still, very straight, and Colton watched something in her break and reform all at once. Grief and rage and years of buried suspicion, finally given a name and a shape. "He killed our father," she said, flat, certain. "He didn't just ruin him. He had him murdered." "That's what this statement claims," Dutton said. "Man who signed it, he's disappeared since. Whether that's Renwick's doing, or just a man too scared to stick around and testify, I can't say for certain. But it's enough to open a formal murder investigation. Enough to bring real charges, if we can find him and make them stick." "If," Colton repeated. You keep saying if, because Renwick's not going to sit quiet and let this happen. Dutton's eyes were grim. Man's already burned your barn and shot you once, Colt. Once he learns this evidence exists, once he learns it's connecting him directly to a murder charge, he's not going to run. Man like that doesn't run. He comes to finish what he started. The words hung in that kitchen like a held breath. Freya turned to Colton, and in her eyes he saw something that hadn't been there before. Not even after the fire, not even after the gunshot. Something that looked like a woman finally ready to stop running. He's coming here, she said. Then we'll be ready for him, Colton said. All of us. Together, they rebuilt the barn in 9 days, not because 9 days was enough time. It wasn't. But because Colton refused to let Renwick's fire be the last word on anything, and because half of Promise Ridge showed up to help once, the truth about the murdered father started working its way through town like a slow-burning fuse. That was the strange thing about truth. It traveled slower than rumor, always had. But once it arrived heavy, and it didn't leave room for the lies that came before it. Cassidy Marsh showed up with lumber he hadn't been asked to bring. Sheriff Dutton worked a full day with a hammer in his hand, which nobody had ever seen him do for any reason. Even Mrs. Abernathy, who'd been among the loudest voices whispering unnatural outside the church that terrible Sunday, arrived with a basket of bread and a face that couldn't quite meet Freya's eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. 2 words, stiff, awkward, set down on the porch rail beside the bread. Like an offering she wasn't sure would be accepted. Freya looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Colton, watching from the half-finished barn frame, felt his chest go tight with worry that this might turn into something ugly. "Thank you for the bread," Freya said instead. Quiet. Not warm, exactly. But not cold either. Just honest. Apology accepted. Trust takes longer. Mrs. Abernathy nodded like that was fair. Because it was. Other apologies came in the days after. Some clumsy, some genuine, some clearly motivated by simple fear of being on the wrong side of a story that was rapidly becoming the whole territory's business. Freya accepted each one the same way. Politely. Without warmth she didn't feel yet, but without cruelty either. Colton watched her do it and understood, more than he had before, the particular kind of strength it took to forgive people who had never once earned it, simply because holding on to anger for every one of them would have cost more than she had left to spend. The telegram came to Sheriff Dutton's office on a gray Tuesday morning, 10 days after the barn fire, and Dutton wrote it straight out to the ranch himself, face grim under his hat brim. "He's coming," Dutton said before he'd even swung down off his horse. Renwick himself. Not hired men this time. Him, personally. Arriving on tomorrow's stage, and he's bringing lawyers. Colton's stomach dropped. For what? Guardianship claim. Dutton handed over the telegram, and Colton read it twice, the same way he'd read the bank's letter weeks before, hoping the words might change on the second pass. They didn't. He's filed papers back in Boston. Claims he's the legal guardian of all 4 Nordall sisters, appointed by a Massachusetts court after their father's death. Says you're all harboring runaways. Freya, standing on the porch, went very still. "That's a lie," she said. "There is no guardianship. There never was. Paper doesn't know the difference between a lie and the truth, ma'am." Dutton's voice was gentle but unflinching. "Paper just says what it says. And out here, a long way from any Massachusetts courthouse that could tell you different, that paper's going to carry weight with anybody who doesn't already know your story. So he's going to walk in here," Colton said slowly, "wave some papers around and just take them. He's going to try." Dutton met Colton's eyes, steady. "Question is whether this town lets him." They didn't sleep much that night. Nobody did. Colton found Freya on the porch again, same as that first fear-heavy night weeks ago, except now there was no careful distance between them, no polite formality holding them apart. She leaned into him without being asked, and he wrapped his good arm around her, and for a long while, neither of them said anything at all. "I keep thinking," Freya said finally, "about what happens if he wins. If some judge somewhere, 1,000 miles from here, decides a piece of paper matters more than the truth, he's not winning. You don't know that, I do. Actually, Colton's voice was quiet but certain. Because I've watched you face down armed men on horseback without blinking. I've watched this whole family rebuild a barn in 9 days flat because they refused to let one man burn away everything they built. Renwick's got money and paper. We've got something he can't buy. What's that? Each other. Freya turned her face up to his, and even in the dark, even with everything hanging over them, Colton saw the ghost of a smile there. That's either the most romantic thing you've ever said, she murmured, or the most foolishly optimistic. Can't it be both? Renwick arrived on the noon stage the following day, and half of Promise Ridge turned out to watch, because word had spread fast about exactly who was coming and exactly what he claimed to be owed. He stepped down from the coach in a tailored suit that seemed to repel the dust of the street itself, silvering at the temples. Handsome in the particular way of men who'd never once had to work for anything with their own hands. He carried himself like a man who already knew how the day was going to end. 2 lawyers flanked him. Thin men with thinner briefcases, and behind them Colton noticed another figure, older. Weathered, watching everything with a stillness that suggested he wasn't part of Renwick's performance at all, but something separate. Something waiting to see how this played out before deciding which side of it he belonged on. Renwick's eyes found Freya first, standing on the platform beside Colton and her sisters, and something crossed his face that might have been satisfaction. Eleonora. He used a name Colton had never heard, and watched Freya's whole body stiffen at the sound of it. My dear girl. I have been so terribly worried. That's not my name, Freya said. Flat. Cold. Hasn't been since the day you had my father murdered. A ripple went through the gathered crowd. Renwick's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went sharp and dangerous. Grief does strange things to the mind, he said smoothly, glancing at the crowd like he was performing for them, which Colton realized he absolutely was. I understand these poor girls have suffered, which is precisely why I've come, to bring them home, where they belong. They're home already, Colton said, stepping forward. Right here. Ah. Renwick's gaze slid to him, cold and appraising. You must be the ringleader of this little arrangement. Mr. Hollis, I presume. The man who's been harboring my wards under false pretenses. There's no guardianship, Renwick. There never was. One of the lawyers stepped forward, producing papers with a practiced flourish. I have here a court order from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, affirming Mr. Renwick's guardianship over Eleonora, Sigrid, Ingrid, and Liv Nordahl. Minor children of the late, they're not children, Colton cut in, they're grown women. Every one of them past the age of majority, the lawyer's mouth pinched. Guardianship in cases of unique circumstance can extend beyond the standard age of majority, given the particular needs of the wards in question. Unique circumstance, Freya repeated, and her voice had gone very quiet. Very dangerous. You mean because of what we are, Renwick said, smooth as poured honey, that women of your particular condition require special oversight. For their own protection, and for the protection of those around them. His eyes swept the crowd again, deliberate, cultivating fear the way a farmer cultivates crops. Surely everyone here understands the wisdom in that. Colton felt something hot and furious rising in his chest. You're not here to protect anybody. You burned my barn. You had men shoot me in my own yard. You murdered their father. And now you're standing here in a $500 suit, talking about protection. Like the word means anything coming out of your mouth. Something flickered across Renwick's composed face. Fast. Gone almost before it registered. But Colton had seen it, and he understood in that moment that he'd landed a blow that actually hurt. Sheriff Dutton stepped forward, thumbs hooked in his belt, expression carefully neutral. Mr. Renwick. I've got reason to believe you're connected to an arson and attempted murder committed on the Hollis property 10 days back. I've also got a sworn statement connecting you to a death in Boston. Several years past of one Eric Nordahl. Renwick's lawyer opened his mouth to object. Renwick raised a single hand, silencing him without even looking his way. Allegations, Renwick said smoothly, nothing more. Grieving young women, desperate men, clinging to a failing ranch. all conspiring to smear a respectable businessman's reputation. He tilted his head, almost pitying. Sheriff, I understand this is a small town. I understand you're accustomed to handling small matters. But I would remind you that I have considerable resources and considerable patience for defending my good name against baseless accusation that a threat, Dutton asked, a statement of fact. Renwick's smile never wavered. Now, I believe we have a legal matter to settle. My wards, if you please. Nobody moved. The silence stretched, taut and dangerous, and Colton felt the whole street holding its breath. Then Freya stepped forward, chin high, shoulders back, every inch of her considerable height drawn up straight, and she looked Augustus Renwick dead in the eye in front of the entire gathered town. You want to talk about resources, she said, about patience. Let me tell you what I have, Mr. Renwick. I have 3 sisters who watched you destroy our father, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of him but a name in a court record and a grave he didn't deserve. I have witnessed with my own eyes what your hired men are willing to do for money. I have a scar on my arm from a bullet meant for the man I love. Her voice rose, carrying clear and hard across the silent street. And I have exactly 0 interest in going anywhere with you. Not now, not ever, Eleonora. My name, she said, cutting him off with a voice like a closing door, is Freya. For a moment, just a moment. Renwick's composure cracked entirely. Something ugly moved across his face. Something that had probably been there all along, hidden underneath the tailored suits and the practiced charm. You will regret this, he said, low, meant only for her, though half the street heard it anyway. You have no idea what you're throwing away. I know exactly what I'm keeping, Freya said. That's the difference between us. That was when the older man, the one who'd been standing quiet at the edge of Renwick's party, finally stepped forward. Mr. Renwick, his voice was rough, weathered, and carried an authority that made even the lawyers straighten up. I believe it's time I introduced myself properly. Name's Halloran. Pinkerton Agency, retired 3 years back, though I still do the odd piece of consulting work. You'll have heard the name Cobb from your sheriff. He's a colleague of mine. Same agency, same case, working 2 ends of it. He tracked the paper trail in Boston. I tracked the money out here. He turned to Colton and Freya. I was hired, some weeks back, by a man in Boston to look into the Nordahl family's whereabouts. Man who hired me didn't give his own name at first. Took some digging to learn it was you, Mr. Renwick. Renwick's face had gone the color of old ash. That's an outrageous. I've been doing this work 30 years. Halloran continued, unbothered, and in 30 years I've developed a fair sense for when a client is telling me a story, and when he's telling me the truth. You told me a story, Mr. Renwick. Grieving guardian, missing wards, all very touching. He reached into his coat and produced a slim folder. Except while I was tracking down these ladies, I also tracked down a few other things. Financial records, correspondence, a man in Boston who used to keep your books before he had a crisis of conscience and started talking. The street had gone utterly silent now. Even the wind seemed to have stopped to listen. Records show a considerable payment, Halloran said, made 3 days before Eric Nordahl's death, to a man since identified as the individual who arranged that death. Records also show payments more recent, to 3 men matching the description of those who attacked the Hollis Ranch 10 days ago and left its owner with a bullet in his shoulder. He closed the folder. I don't work for you anymore, Mr. Renwick. Terminated my own employment the moment I understood what kind of man I was actually working for. And I'll be handing this folder over to the Territorial Marshal's office, along with a full report. Renwick stood very still, and Colton watched, with something close to satisfaction, as the man's careful mask, finally, completely shattered. You have no idea what you've done, Renwick hissed, and for the first time his voice had lost every trace of its smooth, cultivated charm. I built an empire. I am not some petty thug you can arrest on the word of a broken-down detective and a family of freaks. That's enough, Colton said, and his voice cut through the street like a rifle shot. Renwick's eyes swung to him, wild now, cornered. You think this ranch, this town, this pathetic little arrangement you've built protects you? I will bury you. I will bury all of you. He never finished the threat, because that was the moment Sheriff Dutton stepped forward, hand resting on his sidearm. Expression harder than Colton had ever seen it. Augustus Renwick, you're under arrest. Conspiracy to commit murder. Arson. Attempted murder of a territorial citizen. Dutton's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. You've got the right to a fair trial. Which is more than you gave Eric Nordahl. What happened next happened fast, the way real danger always does. Faster than the mind can properly process until it's already over. Renwick's hand moved toward his coat. Colton saw it. Saw the flash of metal beneath the fine fabric, and his whole body went cold, with the certainty of what was about to happen. And there was no time at all to close the distance and stop it. Except Freya moved faster. She crossed the space between them in a single stride, faster than a woman her size should have been able to move, and her hand closed around Renwick's wrist, before the pistol had even cleared his coat. Colton heard the crack of bone, heard Renwick's scream of pain and fury, as the weapon dropped uselessly to the dusty street. And then Freya had him by the collar, lifting him nearly off his feet with one arm, the way she'd lifted that gunman off his horse weeks before. You are done, she said, low and shaking, with a fury that had been building for years. Hurting my family, she didn't throw him. Didn't need to. Just held him there, suspended, helpless, while Sheriff Dutton crossed the street with his cuffs already out, and the entire town of Promise Ridge watched a woman they'd once called unnatural bring down the most dangerous man any of them had ever met with nothing but her bare hands and a will made of iron. Ma'am, Dutton said quietly, you can set him down now. Freya looked at Renwick for a long moment. At the fear finally visible in his eyes, the same fear he'd spent years planting in other people without ever once feeling it himself, she set him down. And as Dutton snapped the cuffs around his wrists, as the crowd began to murmur, not with fear now, but with something closer to awe, Freya turned away from Augustus Renwick without another word, because he had already stopped mattering. She was looking at Colton instead, at her sisters, at the family she'd nearly lost everything trying to protect. There was one more piece of business left before the street could fully breathe again. Halloran cleared his throat. One more thing, Mr. Hollis. Renwick's assets are about to be seized pending trial. That includes a note he purchased from Merchants Trust. Your ranch's note. Colton felt his stomach drop all over again, a different kind of fear this time. What happens to it? Territorial law's clear enough from this point. A note held by a man convicted of using it as an instrument of extortion stay valid. Halloran allowed himself something close to a smile. Judge Whitfield's going to void it entirely, soon as the paperwork clears. Way I hear it, the bank's already agreed to reissue you a fair note at a fair rate once this settles. Seems half the territory's taken an interest in seeing the Hollis place make it through winter. Colton let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 2 months straight. Beside him, Freya's hand found his, and neither of them said anything, because some kinds of relief didn't need words. The trial, when it came, was swift, because Halloran's evidence was thorough, and the man who'd talked in Boston, the man who Boston had talked to more than just one Pinkerton, and because the 3 hired guns who'd burned the barn, once they understood their employer wasn't coming to save them, proved remarkably willing to testify in exchange for lighter sentences of their own. Augustus Renwick was convicted. Conspiracy, arson, attempted murder. The territorial judge, a stern man named Whitfield, who'd clearly heard enough of the story to have formed strong opinions about it, handed down a sentence that ensured Renwick would spend the remainder of his considerable fortune and a good portion of his remaining years somewhere far away from Montana and far away from anyone he might ever threaten again. Colton didn't attend the sentencing. Neither did Freya. They'd both decided, without needing to discuss it, that they'd given that man enough of their lives. Already, instead, they stood on the porch of the newly rebuilt barn, watching the last of the autumn light stretch long and gold across land that had, against every terrible odds, survived. It's over, Freya said, quiet, like she still couldn't quite believe the words. It's over, Colton agreed. She turned to him, and something in her face had changed since that first day on the stage platform. The weariness was gone. The careful, Guarded distance she'd kept between herself and the world for so many years had softened into something Colton had never expected to see on her. Peace, I used to think, she said slowly, that I'd spend my whole life being afraid of what people saw when they looked at me, of what I might do if I ever stopped holding myself back. Her eyes found his, steady now. Sure. I don't feel that fear anymore, Colton. Not since the day you looked at a woman, throwing armed men off horses, and told me you'd never seen anything as brave in your whole life. I meant every word. I know you did. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. Let her enormous, capable fingers wrap around his, like they'd been made to fit there. That's why I'm not afraid anymore. The wedding came 3 weeks later. On a clear October morning with frost, still silvering the grass and the whole territory, smelling like wood smoke and coming winter. They didn't hold one ceremony. They held four. Colton and Freya first, standing together in front of the little church that had once emptied out at the sight of them, now packed so full that half the town had to stand outside the open doors, just to hear the vows exchanged. Reeve and Sigrid next, they clasped palms. And if anyone had told Colt six months earlier that his brother's sharp-tongued verbal sparring partner would become the love of his life, Colton would have laughed himself sick. But there they stood, and when Reeve said his vows, voice cracking with a sincerity nobody had ever heard from him before, Sigrid cried in a way that made her own sisters swear they'd never seen before either. Abel and Ingrid, quiet and steady, hands intertwined, a shared sketchbook of quilt patterns, tucked carefully into Ingrid's bouquet as a small private joke between the two of them that made Abel smile in a way that transformed his whole careful, serious face. And Tate and Liv, the youngest of both families, standing together with the easy, unguarded joy of two people who'd never once had to fight their way toward each other, because they'd found the path easy from the very first day. Colton stood at the front of that church, his wife's enormous steady hand in his, and looked out at the packed pews, at a town that had once whispered ugly words in a dusty street and now stood shoulder to shoulder celebrating. A family it had almost let a stranger's money and a stranger's cruelty tear apart. Sheriff Dutton sat near the back, hat in his lap, looking uncharacteristically emotional for a man who usually kept his feelings locked tighter than a bank vault. Cassidy Marsh sat beside his wife, grinning ear to ear. Even Mrs. Abernathy was there, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The woman who'd once whispered unnatural, now weeping happy tears at a wedding she'd nearly helped prevent from happening at all. After the ceremony, out in the churchyard, Freya found a quiet moment away from the crowd, standing beneath the same autumn sky that had watched her step down off that stage a lifetime ago, terrified and defiant, and utterly unsure whether this new land would ever accept her. Colton found her there, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and felt her lean back into him, solid and sure, and finally home. You know what I keep thinking about, she said. What's that? That first day. On the platform, I thought, if these men take one look at us and turn us away, we'll have nowhere left to go. Her voice was soft, thoughtful, watching the last of the wedding guests spill out into the golden afternoon light. I never imagined it would end like this. A whole town standing up for us. A family that isn't just tolerating what we are, but is actually truly proud of it. You earned every bit of it, Colton said. Every single day since you got off that stage, you earned it. She turned in his arms to face him, and the love in her eyes was so open, so unguarded, that Colton felt his own chest ache, with the sheer weight of how far they'd both traveled to arrive at this moment. My father used to tell me, she said quietly, that the things that make us different aren't curses. They're just truths other people haven't learned to understand yet. Her hand came up to rest against Colton's cheek, warm and strong and steady. I think he'd have loved you. I think he'd have been glad to know that somewhere out here, in the middle of nowhere, his daughters finally found people willing to see them clearly. I see you clearly, Colton said. I have since the very first day. I know, Freya whispered. That's why I fell in love with you. Behind them, the church bells rang out across Promise Ridge, clear and bright in the cold autumn air. 4 weddings, born out of desperation and fear, had become something neither Renwick's money nor anyone's whispered cruelty could ever have predicted. A home, built by people who had chosen, against every easy instinct, to see each other clearly,